My wife didn't notice when I detached. That's the part that still gets me. I didn't explode, I didn't cheat, I didn't walk out in the middle of the night with a suitcase. I just slowly disappeared right in front of her. And she never saw it coming. Years later, when her sister called me asking for something she suddenly needed, that's when everything she ignored finally came due. Before I tell you how all of this unfolded, do me a small favor. If you enjoy real-life stories about quiet betrayals, slow awakenings, and the kind of strength that builds when no one is watching, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment about where you're listening from. It helps these stories reach people who might need them more than they realize. I'm Evan. I'm 38 now. And for a long time, I was the kind of man who believed that if you stayed steady, loyal, and patient, things would eventually work themselves out. I believed marriage was about endurance. About sticking it out even when it felt lonely. Especially then. Clara and I had been married for 6 years when I first realized something was wrong, not in a dramatic way, not after a fight or some shocking discovery. It was quieter than that. It showed up in the spaces between conversations. In the way she'd nod without really listening. In how my words seemed to land somewhere behind her, never quite reaching her attention. At first, I blamed stress. We both worked demanding jobs. Life gets busy. That's what people say when they don't want to look too closely at what's breaking. I told myself this was normal. That marriage settles. That the fireworks fade and companionship takes over. But companionship requires two people present. And somewhere along the line, I became background noise. I'd talk about my day and realize halfway through that she was scrolling on her phone. I'd suggest dinner together and she'd say, maybe later, then forget. I'd sit next to her on the couch, close enough to touch, yet completely alone. When I stopped initiating conversations, she didn't notice. When I stopped sharing my thoughts, she didn't ask why. That's when the detachment started. Not consciously. Not as a strategy. It was self-preservation. When being open hurts more than being quiet, you learn to retreat. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped making plans. I stopped expecting anything from her at all. And the terrifying part? Our marriage looked fine from the outside. We still lived together. Still attended family gatherings. Still smiled in photos. If anyone asked, Clara would say we were good. I would nod along, because correcting that would require explaining something she didn't seem interested in understanding. I didn't leave. I didn't threaten divorce. I didn't even tell her I was unhappy. I just started building a life in my own head. One where I didn't need her attention to feel real. I threw myself into work. Took on extra projects. Started freelancing on the side. When I wasn't working, I went to the gym late at night. Long walks. Headphones in. Thoughts finally loud enough to hear. Clara never asked where I was going. That's what hurt the most. Not the arguments we never had, but the questions she never asked. Not once did she sit me down and say, you seem different. Not once did she ask if I was okay. You can only feel invisible for so long before you start believing you are. By the time I moved out emotionally, she still thought we were married in every way that mattered. We shared a roof, a schedule, a last name. But the man she married was already gone, quietly rebuilding himself somewhere she never looked. And then, one day, years later, after all that silence, after all that absence, my phone rang. It wasn't Clara. It was her sister. And that call is where everything finally came into the open. But that comes next. By the time Naomi called, it had been almost 3 years since I'd fully detached. Not separated. Not divorced. Detached. There's a difference, and anyone who's lived it knows exactly what I mean. Detachment isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just slowly replaces hope with distance until the two people sharing a life are strangers who happen to know each other's schedules. Naomi's name flashing on my screen stopped me cold. Clara's sister and I had never been close. Cordial, polite, surface level. The kind of relationship built on holidays and forced smiles. She never called me directly. Ever. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. Evan? Her voice sounded tight, strained. Like someone who'd rehearsed what they were about to say and still wasn't sure how to start. Yeah, I said. What's going on? There was a pause. Then, I hope it's okay I'm calling you. I didn't know who else to reach out to. That sentence alone told me everything. Whatever this was, it wasn't casual. It wasn't a check-in. It wasn't about Clara missing me or wanting to talk. It was about need. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting to the window of my apartment. I'd moved out a year earlier, quietly. Told Clara I needed space. She'd shrugged and said, if that's what you need, like I'd asked to rearrange the furniture instead of my entire life. What's wrong? I asked. Naomi exhaled slowly. It's Clara. Things aren't good. I almost laughed, but not out of humor. Out of irony. Things hadn't been good for a long time. They just hadn't been inconvenient until now. She's been struggling, Naomi continued. Financially. Emotionally. She didn't tell anyone how bad it was. She's in a bit of trouble. There it was. Trouble. The kind that finally made absence noticeable. I didn't respond right away. I was trying to decide how honest to be. Whether to play the role everyone expected of me, the dependable husband who steps in when things fall apart, or the man who'd learned, painfully, that being needed isn't the same as being valued. What kind of trouble? I asked. Naomi hesitated. She made some decisions. Assumed certain things would work out. They didn't. And now she needs help. Help. A word I'd offered for years without being asked. I closed my eyes briefly. Does Clara know you're calling me? Yes, Naomi said quickly. She asked me to. She didn't know how to reach out herself. Of course she didn't. Because reaching out would mean acknowledging what she'd ignored. It would mean admitting she'd lost something before she realized it mattered. What does she want? I asked. Naomi's voice softened. She wants to talk. She wants to understand where things went wrong. And she was hoping you might help her get back on her feet. There it was. The full ask, finally said out loud. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. Naomi shifted on the other end, probably wondering if she'd pushed too far. Evan, she said gently, I know things between you two haven't been great. But you're still her husband. That word hit differently than it used to. Husband. Once, it meant commitment. Responsibility. Partnership. Now it felt like a title people remembered only when it benefited them. I was her husband when I needed her, too, I said quietly. She didn't notice then. Naomi didn't argue. That surprised me. I know, she said. I've seen it. I didn't think it would get this far. Neither did I. But neglect has a way of compounding quietly until it collapses something all at once. We agreed to meet. Not at Clara's place. Not anywhere personal. A neutral cafe near Maplewood Commons. Public. Controlled. 1 hour. That was my condition. When I arrived, Clara was already there. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. The confidence she used to carry so easily was gone, replaced by something brittle. She stood when she saw me, hesitated like she wasn't sure if she should hug me, then sat back down. Hi, she said. Hi, I replied, taking the seat across from her. Naomi excused herself after a moment, saying she'd give us space. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Clara stared at her coffee like it might give her answers. You look different, she said finally. So do you, I replied. Not unkindly. Just honestly. She nodded. I didn't think. I didn't realize how far apart we'd gotten. That sentence summed up our entire marriage. She didn't realize. I leaned back. That's kind of the point. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for the first time. I know I wasn't present. I know I should have listened more. I just didn't think you were leaving. I didn't leave, I said calmly. I stopped waiting. That landed. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed. She started explaining then. The choices she'd made. The risks she'd taken. The assumptions she'd built her plans on. She talked fast, like if she didn't get it all out, I might stand up and walk away. As she spoke, something strange happened. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt detached. Observing. Like I was listening to someone else's story. The emotional distance I'd built hadn't vanished just because she finally saw the damage. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly. Waiting. For what? I asked. For help, she said softly. For us. I took a slow breath. Clara, I spent years trying to be part of us on my own. I told myself it was enough. It wasn't. She reached for my hand. I gently pulled it back. This isn't about punishment, I continued. It's about reality. You didn't notice when I disappeared. That doesn't reverse just because things are hard now. Her eyes filled with tears. So that's it? I stood. That's honesty. I left money on the table for my coffee and walked out without looking back. Not because I wanted to hurt her. But because staying would have meant pretending I could step back into a role that no longer fit. Later that night, Naomi texted me. She thanked me for meeting Clara. Said she understood if I needed distance. I replied with one sentence. I hope she finds what she's looking for, but I can't be the one to fix what I didn't break. And for the first time since detaching, I slept peacefully. Because choosing myself no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like survival. After that meeting, something shifted, not in Clara, not immediately anyway, but in me. For the first time since I'd started pulling away, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was standing still, finally grounded, finally clear about where I ended and where she began. The days that followed were quiet. No calls from Clara. No messages asking me to reconsider. Naomi sent one short text a few days later, letting me know Clara was staying with her for a while and that she was processing things. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but because I'd learned that constant availability had always been my undoing. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be a boundary instead of a wound. Work became my anchor. ClearPath Solutions had just landed a mid-sized contract, and I was leading the back-end coordination. Long hours, problem-solving, real impact. For years, I'd been told, indirectly, casually, that my work wasn't impressive enough, that I lacked ambition. Funny how capable I felt once no one was undermining me in my own home. I also reconnected with people I hadn't seen in a while. Marcus and I started meeting up on Wednesday nights again, grabbing takeout and watching whatever game was on. Jonah, my old roommate, invited me to a small dinner party where I met people who knew nothing about my marriage, my detachment, or my past. They only knew me as Evan, the guy who listened, who showed up, who didn't disappear mid-conversation. That mattered more than I expected. A month passed. Then 2. I thought that would be the end of it. That Clara would rebuild her life without me, and I'd continue building mine without her. Clean. Simple. Not easy, but clear. I underestimated how hard it is for people to accept consequences once they finally understand them. It started with an email. Not from Clara, from her lawyer. The subject line was neutral. Procedural. It made my stomach drop anyway. She was filing for a formal separation, citing abandonment. That word almost made me laugh. Abandonment implies sudden absence. Neglect. Disappearance. What I'd done was the opposite. I'd been present long after my presence stopped mattering. Still, seeing it framed that way stung more than I expected. I didn't panic. I forwarded the email to my attorney, someone Marcus had recommended months earlier, just in case. At the time, hiring a lawyer had felt dramatic. Now it felt prudent. Clara followed up a few days later with a message of her own. Long, emotional. Contradictory. She said she didn't want to fight. She said she felt blindsided. She said she didn't realize how bad things were until it was too late. She said she hoped we could work something out fairly. Fairly. That word kept echoing in my head. Fair would have been noticing when I stopped talking. Fair would have been asking why I no longer laughed the way I used to. Fair would have been caring before everything collapsed. Still, I agreed to mediation. Not because I owed her that, but because I wanted this chapter closed cleanly. No lingering threads. No unfinished conversations. The mediation session was held in a bland office downtown. Neutral colors. Soft lighting. Everything designed to keep emotions from boiling over. Clara looked exhausted. Not fragile, just worn down. Like someone who'd been fighting reality and losing. She spoke first. About how she felt overwhelmed, how she'd assumed I'd always be there, how she hadn't understood detachment until it was staring her in the face. She apologized. Properly this time. Not defensively. Not vaguely. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every missed moment or ignored attempt. I said one thing. I stopped feeling like I mattered in my own marriage. That was it. The mediator nodded slowly, like she'd heard that sentence 100 times before and knew exactly where it led. The separation terms were straightforward. No kids. No shared business interests. Assets split cleanly. Clara asked if I'd consider counseling together, not to reconcile, she said, but for closure. I declined. Some doors don't need to be reopened just so you can prove you've locked them. After everything was signed, Clara asked me something quietly, as we were gathering our things. Do you hate me? I looked at her and answered honestly. No. But I don't miss us. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Walking out of that office felt lighter than I thought it would. Not triumphant. Not celebratory. Just, done. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. I still had lonely evenings. Still had moments where I caught myself reaching for my phone to share something with someone who was no longer part of my world. Healing isn't linear. It's repetitive. You relearn the same lesson until it sticks. But something new entered my life then, not romance, not immediately. Clarity. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped around being accommodating. Being the steady one. The one who didn't ask for much. I'd confused that with strength. Real strength, I was learning, looks a lot like self-respect. Around that time, Naomi reached out again. Not about Clara. About herself. She wanted to apologize, for not speaking up sooner, for noticing the imbalance and doing nothing. We met for coffee. This time, the conversation felt different. Honest. Unburdened. I didn't think you'd ever leave, she admitted. You always seemed so solid. I smiled faintly. That was the problem. She told me Clara was starting therapy. That she was finally confronting patterns she'd ignored for years. I wished her well. Truly. Growth doesn't have to be shared to be valid. As summer turned into fall, I felt something else creeping in, not longing, not regret. Space. Space to breathe. To think. To exist without constantly monitoring someone else's mood or attention. I filled that space with small things. Cooking meals I actually enjoyed. Morning runs. Books I'd abandoned halfway through years ago. One night, sitting alone on my balcony, city lights flickering in the distance, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, but those two things aren't the same. And for the first time in a long time, being alone didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a foundation. By the time winter settled in, the separation papers were finalized. No courtroom drama. No last-minute pleas. Just signatures, quiet nods, and the closing of a door that should have been shut years earlier. When I walked out of that office for the last time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. And clarity, I've learned, is far more powerful than relief. The strange thing about emotional detachment is that people only recognize it once it's complete. Clara hadn't noticed when I stopped sharing my thoughts. She hadn't noticed when I stopped planning our future. She hadn't noticed when I moved into the spare bedroom, then eventually into a different apartment altogether. But she noticed the moment I stopped being available. That pattern didn't escape me anymore. The weeks after the separation were quiet in a way that finally felt right. My place was small, functional, and unmistakably mine. No negotiating over decor. No unspoken tension. Just space. I set up a routine that belonged to me alone. Morning workouts. Coffee in silence. Evenings spent reading or working on freelance projects without someone sighing at the glow of my laptop. Marcus joked one night over dinner that I seemed lighter, like someone who'd finally stopped carrying a weight he didn't realize he'd been hauling around. He wasn't wrong. Around that time, something unexpected happened. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just unexpected. I met someone. Her name was Rachel. No fireworks. No instant chemistry that knocked the air out of my lungs. We met through work. She was consulting on a project ClearPath had brought in temporarily. Smart, observant, quietly confident. We talked during breaks. Then coffee. Then walks after work. What stood out wasn't how much she liked me, it was how naturally she paid attention. She remembered things. Asked follow-up questions. Not because she was trying to impress me, but because she was actually listening. The first time she noticed I'd gone quiet and asked if something was on my mind, it nearly stopped me in my tracks. I realized how starved I'd been for that. I didn't rush anything. I wasn't interested in replacing Clara or filling a void. I wanted to build something slowly, honestly. Rachel respected that. She had her own history, her own boundaries. We moved at a pace that felt mutual, not forced. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was shrinking to fit into someone else's life. Then, almost a year after Naomi's first call, my phone rang again. It was Naomi. This time, her voice was calmer. Softer. I wanted you to hear it from me, she said. Clara's engaged. I absorbed that in silence. I thought you should know, she added quickly. Not because it changes anything. Just so it doesn't come out of nowhere. Thanks for telling me, I said. And I meant it. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, waiting for something to hit me. Anger. Sadness. Regret. Nothing did. That's when I knew I was truly done. A few weeks later, Naomi called again. This time, she was nervous. There's something I need to ask you, she said. And you're allowed to say no. That alone told me how much had changed. Clara was dealing with the fallout of some old financial decisions again. Complications. Loose ends. And somehow, my name had come up, not because I was legally involved, but because once upon a time, I was the one who handled problems quietly. Efficiently. Without complaint. Naomi didn't push. She didn't guilt me. She just asked. And I said no. Not angrily. Not defensively. Just calmly. I can't be part of that anymore, I told her. I hope things work out, but I'm not the person she leans on now. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that stuck with me. I think this is the first time anyone's ever really set that boundary with her. After that, the call stopped. Not in a dramatic way. Just, naturally. Like the final thread loosening. Rachel and I continued building something steady. Real. We didn't rush into labels. We talked about expectations early. About communication. About what it means to show up before things fall apart. It felt adult in a way my marriage never had. One evening, sitting across from her at dinner, she asked me something simple. Do you ever miss your old life? I thought about it carefully before answering. I miss who I thought I was supposed to be, I said. But not who I actually was. She nodded, like that made perfect sense. Now, when I look back, I don't frame my story as loss. I don't think of it as abandonment or betrayal. I think of it as awakening. I didn't detach to punish my wife. I detached because staying was slowly erasing me. And the moment I stopped disappearing for someone else's comfort, everything else started to fall into place. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of my story, if you feel unseen, unheard, or quietly fading in a relationship, understand this: you don't need permission to matter. You don't need a crisis to justify leaving. And you don't owe anyone endless patience at the cost of your own self-respect. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't walking away loudly. It's leaving quietly, rebuilding steadily, and refusing to return to places that only noticed you when you were useful. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor before you go: subscribe, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. You never know who's silently detaching right now, waiting for a sign that choosing themselves is allowed.